At the age of 8, that would have been 1952. That's when I started painting. In 1956, I went to Friends Academy Locust Valley, which is probably one of the finest schools in the world. And a good deal of, not necessarily art, because I was learning art independently, so didn't really have that need to do it in school. But the passion and the dedication of the teachers, the rigorous program, it taught me how to think and analyze. In particular, my English teacher, Mrs. Stubbs, if you have ever had a great teacher, you never forget them. They're indelible. And she taught us one thing which has been throughout all of my artwork and all of my thought process, which is when you analyze an artwork and when you set out to do it yourself, she said, where is the universal truth? So that is always for me the starting point, whether I'm looking at a work of art or I'm creating a work of art. So I graduated from there in 1960. I first went to Stanford, which had it was a great school, but had a really poor art department. There was no teacher, there were only 2 students. So I left there and I went to NYU thinking, sort of going back home so I could commute. And thinking they had a great art department, but the studio art was not so wonderful. But I landed up doing my art history with Professor Jansen, H.W. Jansen, who wrote Jansen's History of Art. And it gave me a tremendous passion for art history, which has stayed with me throughout my life and keeps resurfacing again and again and again. Not just the appreciation, but the ability to analyze, to contextualize, to understand where it fits into the great stream of art history, and also to be able to, when I'm looking at contemporary arts, to be able to fit them into that picture and sort of project where they might land up in the future. So anyway, but I was not satisfied there because of the lack of studio art, and was really craving it, so I transferred to Skidmore College. And when I got there, my passion was sculpture. I wasn't painting at the time. And for some reason, I was always drawn to metals, whether it was bronze casting. And I don't know, my father was in the shipping business, so when I was young, I used to go to shipyards and I'd see the welders and walk under the ships, and, the sense of massive steel and great bodies of steel. So somehow that was, engraved in my mind. So when I got there, the Skidmore had no welding department. They had a little sculpture department, really nice professor. And he saw what I was trying to do, and he was trying to put together planes of bronze. And I asked him, I said, is there some way that this can be done immediately rather than putting them together in wax and then casting it and then chasing it and patinating it and so on? So he said, yes. He says, as a matter of fact, I have a friend who lives near here, and I'm going to take you to meet him and you can see what he does. So Professor Davidson, one day, we got a car, I borrowed a car, and we drove to Bolton Landing, and we went to David Smith's property, Terminal Iron Works. Wasn't quite sure where I was going or who I was going to meet, but we came over this hill. There was a little rise, and I think it was Route 9. You come over this hill, and all of a sudden you saw this vista, this unbelievable vista of these gigantic metal sculptures going up and down the hillside, and it's just like I couldn't breathe. It was like a great army of sculpture, and it just completely blew me away. I did not know that an artist could work that hard, or be that dedicated, or that ambitious. It took it completely off the easel and all over the landscape. The whole thing was just totally eye-opening. So we drove into his house, up to his house, and he came out. He was working. He was very gruff, He was, I'm busy. I can't deal with this, But after a few minutes, and Professor Davidson explained, I just wanted to learn about the process that he was using. So he took a few minutes off, and he started showing me his studio, and he said, well, I don't really have the time to give this right now, but you're free to look around. So we looked around for a little bit. And he said, well, you can come back another time. So that was sort of a little bit of a go-ahead. And afterwards, I sent him a thank you note, and he wrote me back. And he just, this was in the days of letters, and we had P.O. boxes, and people didn't call much. There were no cell phones. So he said, you can come. But he had told me one thing. He said he doesn't take students, and he doesn't teach anybody how to weld. He says, if you want to come back and you've learned how to weld, you're welcome. You're welcome to come and visit. So I took it very literally, and I went to a machine shop in Saratoga Springs, a welding shop, and I knocked on the door, and a sweet little old lady named Mrs. Stoddard answers the door. And I told her what I wanted to do. She said, speak to my husband. So he came out, Mr. Stoddard, and he showed me around the welding shop. So I started to work there. I wasn't present at school very much, but nobody seemed to notice. Or I believe they did notice, like I believe my teachers did notice, or they probably knew where I was going, and they were very liberal and did not say anything or interfere with that. They didn't insist I come back to the classroom or whatever. So I learned to weld with Mr. Stoddard, all kinds of welding. And when they were out doing grill work on homes, I used to stay in the shop, and I had to learn everything. I had to learn how to weld muffin tins and plows and all kinds of things that rural people would bring in there for repair. So it's a very good training process. So after about 3 or 4 months of this, I got back in touch with David Smith, and I said, well, I learned how to weld. He says, okay, you can come. So I went up there, not knowing what you can come meant, whether you can come work or, is it going to be apprenticeship or whatnot. But when I walked into a studio, there was a little area that had been completely cleared, and it had an arc welder and an acetylene welder and some basic tools and a workbench. It did not occur to me until many years later that he had actually cleared that space out for me. I thought it was just something he was not using or something, but I realized many years later, because he was so meticulous, that there's no way that was accidental. He made a space. Okay, you can go in this corner. And he just said, don't bother me when I'm working. So I was there working in his studio on my own work on the weekends, and sometimes would, play hooky for a day or two and catch an extra day of work. But in the process, I'm always watching him out of the corner of my eye. So I learned his techniques and his processes, observed he had one assistant named Leon who was particularly skilled, doing the beating on the welding and knocking off the slag and the grinding, the sort of the mechanical part of it, not the artistic part of it. And I watched how he laid out the cubi on the floor with chalk marks and cardboard boxes. Anyway, that went on for a little over a year, and we became really good friends. And people sometimes ask me, what was your relationship with David Smith? Were you his girlfriend? Well, I wasn't. And somebody said, well, what were you? I said, his sidekick. So, it was like this very funky relationship. There is this older man, gruff, but it got a big soft spot behind all that gruffness. So I'd go up there and would weld, and I'd be welding, he'd be welding, and then we'd go out to the local bar in our welding clothes and our steel-toed shoes and brakeman's cap. And I never thought this was for any reason weird for a woman or anything unusual about a friendship or relationship between a much older person. Anyway, there came a time where we separated. He had a lot of personal issues. He had some love life disappointments, which kind of really depressed him badly, and he drank too much. And it became difficult to be around him. We'd go to the local bar, but he'd run off the road into a snowbank, and hadn't been that long since Jackson Pollock had died. And he kept talking about 60 being an age where he was terrified of this age, and he was just turning 60. He thought it was the end of life, and he spoke many times about Ernest Hemingway and how Hemingway had the guts and the balls to take his life before it started to go downhill. And the more he drank, the more he bought into this morbid fantasy.